He was 12, sneakers full of holes, a crumpled 5 in his hand. The diner was hot, ceiling fans just pushed the heat around. He waited at the counter while the waitress refilled coffees and ignored him. When he said, "Excuse me, ma'am," she turned her back. Another customer smirked. A man told him to try the back door. The boy's jaw tightened. Then a shadow fell. A Hell's Angel rose from his stool, leather and tattoos, and rumbled 4 words that stopped every fork in the room. "The boy's with me." The boy's name was Jerome. It was 1963 in Jackson, Mississippi. The man in the leather vest was Big Mike, the most feared Hell's Angel in the entire state. He had no reason to care about a black child until 4 words changed everything. What happened next turned a moment of kindness into a lifelong bond that defied every rule of the Jim Crow South. That morning, Jerome Dupree woke up before the sun could peel the paint off the shotgun house he shared with his grandmother. The air was already thick. Jackson, Mississippi, July of 1963, and the heat didn't care who you were. He shook the coins and crumpled bills from a sock he kept under the floorboard, $1.25 earned sweeping hair clippings off the floor of a white barber shop after dark. He'd been saving for 6 months. Today he would buy a hot meal. Not the cornmeal mush and fatback his grandmother stretched for days. A plate of fried chicken, biscuits, gravy, something dignified. Something that made you feel human even when the world said you weren't. His grandmother, Miss Celia, lay in the back room, a wet rag on her forehead. The cough had been loosening ribs all week. She couldn't cook, couldn't stand. The last decent meal they'd shared was church fried fish 3 months ago. She saw him pocket the money and said, "Baby, you watch yourself in town. The sheriff's been pulling colored boys off the sidewalk for breathing wrong." Jerome kissed her cheek and told her he'd be back with supper. That was the plan. 3 miles away, on the highway from Vicksburg, a different kind of hunger was pulling into Jackson. 3 Hell's Angels rode in formation under a broiling sun, Big Mike, Tiny, and Crow. Their choppers were caked in red dust. They'd been riding since dawn, and not a single diner had let them through the door. Too dirty. Too many tattoos. Too much leather on a state that already had enough trouble. Big Mike, 6'5", 300 pounds, a beard that could hide a shotgun, was the kind of man who made deputies rethink their career choices. He had killed men in Korea and never talked about it. He'd been an enforcer for the Oakland chapter before coming south to set up the Mississippi crew. His reputation walked into a room before he did. They pulled into the Dixie Diner off Highway 80 just as Jerome was setting out across the railroad tracks. The diner had a big glowing sign, a lunch counter that could seat 20, and an unwritten rule that had been there since the foundation was poured: whites only. The waitress, Mabel, a thin woman with a beehive hairdo and a pencil behind her ear, filled coffee for the regulars, 2 truckers, a farmer, a man in a suit reading the Clarion Ledger. She saw the 3 bikers push through the door and almost dropped her pot. Not because of the color of their skin, but because they looked like a parole board experiment. She seated them with a shaky smile. Their money was green. That was the only color that mattered to Mabel. Jerome walked through the front door 10 minutes later. The heat outside was 100 degrees. The ceiling fans just pushed the misery around. He had washed his hands twice. He had tucked in his shirt. He stood at the counter, polite as taught, and waited. Mabel passed him 4 times. She topped off the trucker, the farmer, the suit. Then she poured coffee for the bikers, who sat in the corner booth watching the whole thing in silence. When Jerome finally spoke, voice soft as a sparrow, "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned her back so hard the ruffles on her apron snapped. One of the truckers snickered. The farmer didn't look up. The man in the suit lowered his newspaper just enough to say, "Try the back door, boy, or better yet, try somewhere else." Jerome's jaw tightened into a knot. His hand found the money in his pocket and squeezed. He didn't cry. He had learned from his father before a white mob strung him up in 1955 that crying only gave them what they wanted. He stood rooted. Mabel turned, red-faced, and said loud enough for the whole room, "We don't serve your kind here. You deaf or stupid?" That's when the shadow fell. The biker in the corner booth, the biggest of them, unfolded himself from the bench like a wall coming unstuck. His boots made the floorboards ache with each step. The silverware rattled. The trucker stopped mid-chew. Mabel froze. Big Mike walked until he stood directly behind the boy, close enough that Jerome could smell the oil and road sweat. And then, looking directly into Mabel's eyes, he spoke 4 words that hit that diner like a thunderclap. Every fork stopped, every breath held. And in that silence, the first chapter of an impossible friendship began. Mabel's hand stopped midair, the coffee pot tilting, a thin brown stream hitting the counter and pooling around the sugar dispenser. The trucker who had told the boy to try the back door suddenly found his eggs incredibly interesting. The man in the suit lowered his newspaper, his face a study in confusion. A white biker, one of the roughest-looking men he'd ever seen, had just claimed a black child as his own. Big Mike didn't move. He just stood there, an immovable wall of leather and intent, daring anyone to say different. His eyes never left Mabel. "The boy, with me," he repeated, slower this time, like he was explaining gravity to someone who'd never fallen down. "Now bring him a menu." Mabel's mouth opened and closed twice. She looked at the other customers for support. The trucker shook his head almost imperceptibly. The farmer studied the ceiling. The man in the suit folded his paper with trembling hands and walked out, leaving a $5 bill on the counter. Mabel grabbed a menu, slapped it on the counter in front of Jerome, and retreated to the kitchen without a word. Jerome climbed onto the stool next to Big Mike. His feet didn't reach the floor. He uncurled his fist, and there, damp with sweat, was the crumpled $5 bill. He placed it on the counter. Big Mike looked at it, then at the boy. He didn't say anything about the money. He just slid it back toward Jerome and said, "Put that away, son. Breakfast is on me." Tiny and Crow, the other 2 angels, shifted to make room. Tiny was 5'6", built like a refrigerator, with a laugh that could fill a warehouse. Crow was lean, quiet, a former army medic with a rattlesnake tattoo curling up his forearm. They had no idea why their president had done this. Big Mike wasn't known for charity. He was known for breaking a man's jaw in Biloxi for calling him a hippie. But they followed his lead without question. When the food came, Jerome ate like a boy who hadn't seen a hot meal in months because he hadn't. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, collard greens, a biscuit the size of his fist. Big Mike ate slower, watching the kid with an expression that was hard to read. Halfway through the meal, he asked, "What's your name, boy?" "Jerome Dupree, sir." "Your mama and daddy around?" Jerome's fork stopped. He didn't look up. "Mama died of the fever when I was 5. Daddy was killed 8 years ago. They said he looked at a white woman wrong. I live with my grandmother." Big Mike's jaw tightened. The tines of his fork bent slightly under his grip. He knew that story, not the specifics, but the shape of it. He'd seen it 100 times. Black men strung from trees, their bodies left as warnings. He'd never done a damn thing about it, not once. Now here was the son of one of those men, sitting on a stool next to him, eating chicken like it was the first good thing that had ever happened to him. The diner emptied out. The trucker left. The farmer paid and hurried away. Mabel bussed tables with aggressive efficiency, banging plates, refusing to look at the corner booth. Jerome finished his meal and thanked Big Mike. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He asked, "Why'd you do that, mister? Nobody ever stands up for me." Big Mike set down his coffee. He didn't have a clean answer. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood, growing up dirt poor in the Delta, watching his father get beaten by the company foreman for asking for wages. Maybe it was the way the kid had stood there, trembling but refusing to cry. Maybe it was just that he was sick of bullies. Whatever it was too big to explain. So he just said, "Because somebody should have stood up for your daddy." Crow watched this exchange and knew something had shifted. He'd ridden with Big Mike for 6 years and never heard him talk about right and wrong. Tiny later said it felt like watching a glacier melt in real time. They paid the bill, leaving a tip that was triple the cost of the meal. Mabel pocketed it without a word. Outside, the sun was blinding. Jerome was about to walk back home across the tracks when Big Mike stopped him. "Where you live, boy?" "Over on the west side, off Lynch Street." "That's 3 miles. Get on the bike." Jerome hesitated. A black boy on the back of a Hells Angels chopper, riding through downtown Jackson in broad daylight, that wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. But something in Big Mike's tone didn't leave room for argument. He climbed on, hands gripping the leather vest, and the 3 Harleys roared out of the lot, turning every head on Pearl Street. They rolled through the white side of town first, past the courthouse, past the Confederate monument, past the police station where a deputy stepped onto the sidewalk and watched them pass with his hand resting on his holster. Jerome kept his head down. Big Mike didn't. He stared straight ahead, daring anyone to say a word. Nobody did. When they crossed the railroad tracks into the black neighborhood, the reaction was different. People stopped on their porches. Children ran alongside the bikes. An old man sitting outside the pool hall stood up so fast his chair fell over. A Hell's Angel delivering a black child home like he was a dignitary, it was unheard of. Miss Celia was sitting on the front steps when they pulled up, a shawl around her shoulders despite the heat. When she saw her grandson climb off the back of that Harley, her hand went to her chest. She thought the worst. She thought the white man had brought him back in trouble. But Jerome ran to her, smiling, and said, "Grandma, this is Big Mike. He bought me breakfast and brought me home. He stood up for me." Big Mike dismounted slowly. He walked up the crumbling steps, bent his enormous frame, and stuck out his hand. "Ma'am, you raised a good boy. I apologize for the scare, but nobody bothered him while he was with me, and nobody will." Miss Celia looked at that giant, tattooed hand, then at his face. She didn't see a biker. She saw a man who had treated her grandson with dignity when the whole world had withheld it. She took his hand in both of hers and held it. "Thank you, sir. Thank you for bringing my baby home." Big Mike's eyes went wet. He blinked hard and pulled away. "We'll be back tomorrow. I'm gonna fix that porch before somebody falls through it." He meant it. The next morning, 3 Harleys rolled up with lumber strapped to a borrowed trailer. The neighbors gathered, some suspicious, some curious, but mostly stunned. Big Mike, Tiny, and Crow worked all day under the July sun, ripping out rotted boards, setting new beams, nailing down planks until that porch could hold a choir. Jerome handed them nails and fetched water. Miss Celia cooked what little she had: beans, rice, and a pitcher of sweet tea. They ate together on the new porch as the sun went down. But a white man working on a black family's house in Jackson, Mississippi, didn't go unnoticed. By the end of the week, word had spread. The sheriff's department took an interest. A reporter from the Jackson Daily News got a tip and started digging. And a local businessman, a man who owned the barber shop where Jerome swept floors, decided that things were getting dangerously out of hand. He made a phone call that would bring a different kind of motorcycle club to town, one that didn't believe in charity. And that's when the real trouble began. The man on the other end of that phone call was Clayton Hargrove, president of the Dixie Reapers Motorcycle Club. The Reapers didn't ride for brotherhood. They rode for territory. Hargrove had been running drugs and intimidation rackets from Jackson to Meridian for a decade, and the one thing he couldn't stomach was a white man showing weakness toward a black family. When the barber shop owner, a man named Eustace Pritchard, told him about Big Mike rebuilding a porch on the west side, Hargrove laughed so hard he had to put down his cigar. Then he stopped laughing. "You telling me an angel gone soft over some pickaninny and his grandma?" Hargrove asked. "That boy Jeremiah, or whatever his name is, he mops my floor for pennies. Now he's got a 300-pound guardian angel playing carpenter. It's bad for business, Clayton. Bad for the whole town." Folks are getting ideas. Hargrove didn't need to hear more. By sundown, 6 Reapers were parked outside the Dupree house, engines rumbling, headlights cutting through the thin curtains of Miss Celia's front room. Jerome was inside helping his grandmother to bed when he heard the guttural roar. He peeked through the window and saw the silhouettes: men in denim cuts, a different kind of patch on their backs, a coiled rattlesnake over a Confederate flag. Miss Celia's hand gripped his arm. "Don't you go outside, baby. Those ain't the same men." Big Mike, Tiny, and Crow had just finished cleaning their tools at a gas station 3 blocks away when they heard the Reapers' pipes. Big Mike didn't think. He just kicked his bike to life and tore down Lynch Street. By the time he slid to a stop in front of the house, Hargrove was already on the new porch, running his hand along the fresh railing with theatrical disgust. "Nice work, Angel. You do this all by yourself. Or did the little colored boy help?" Big Mike stepped off his bike without a word. His boots hit the dirt like a judge's gavel. Tiny slid a pipe wrench into his back pocket. Crow's hand went to the medic bag under his seat, not for bandages, but for the snub-nosed revolver he carried for moments like this. "You're on the wrong porch, Hargrove," Big Mike said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that scares a man more than shouting. Am I? Because it looks to me like you're the one in the wrong neighborhood. This ain't your cause, Mike. You're up here playing nanny for a boy whose daddy got what he deserved. That's the word from Pritchard. James Dupree was a troublemaker, got himself lynched for leering at a white woman. Now his boy's getting uppity. You don't want that stink on you. The name James Dupree hit Big Mike like a punch to the sternum. He hadn't known the details until now. The boy's father was killed only 8 years ago, which meant it happened in 1955, the same year Emmett Till's body was pulled from the Tallahatchie River. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He thought of Jerome's small fingers clutching the $5 bill, his polite "yes, sir," the way he'd said "my daddy was killed," with no emotion because the emotion had been beaten out of him. Big Mike climbed the steps. Hargrove's men tensed. Hargrove himself didn't flinch. He was used to intimidation. But when Big Mike got close enough that Hargrove could smell the grease and the road and something else, something primal, the Reaper's confidence flickered. "Let me tell you what's going to happen," Big Mike said. "You're going to get back on that bike and you're going to ride out of here, and you're never going to come near this family again. If I see you within a mile of this house, if I so much as hear your name whispered near this boy, I will bury you so deep they'll need a mining crew to find your bones." Hargrove's lip curled. "You think you scare me, Angel. I've got 20 men who will torch this house with everyone inside it. You can't be here every night." Crow stepped forward then, calm as a surgeon. "You're right, he can't. But I've got a little black book with every crime you've committed in the last 10 years, names, dates, copies of police reports that certain people in the sheriff's department have been sitting on. You burned that house. I mailed the book to the FBI field office in New Orleans. Your whole operation goes down." Hargrove's face went pale. He didn't know how much Crow actually had, but the medic had a reputation for being the smartest man in any room. The silence stretched. Finally, Hargrove spat on the porch, turned, and mounted his bike. "This ain't over, Angel. You just made a whole lot of enemies." The Reapers peeled out one by one, their tail lights swallowed by the dark. But Hargrove wasn't bluffing. Over the next 3 days, the intimidation campaign began. A brick with a threatening note sailed through the Dupree's front window. Miss Celia's cough worsened under the stress. The local sheriff, a man named Delroy Baines who owed Pritchard gambling debts, announced he'd be keeping a close eye on all unauthorized gatherings on the west side. The Jackson Daily News ran a thinly veiled article about outlaw bikers exploiting racial tensions, nomming Big Mike as a dangerous outside agitator. What nobody knew, what would only come out years later, was that Pritchard's barber shop was the front for a gambling and loan-sharking empire that kept the town's black residents in perpetual debt, and that James Dupree hadn't been killed for leering at a white woman. He'd been killed because he'd witnessed Pritchard dumping a body in the Pearl River. The lynching was a cover, and Jerome, sweeping hair and listening quietly, was closer to the truth than anyone realized. But in that sweltering August of 1963, Big Mike didn't know any of that. He just knew a child was being terrorized and a sick old woman was lying awake listening for motorcycle engines. So he made a phone call of his own to the national president of the Hells Angels. He cashed in every favor he'd earned in a decade of service. And 3 days later, 45 angels from 5 states rolled into Jackson, not to fight, but to form a human wall around the Dupree house. It was the largest gathering of Hell's Angels in Mississippi history, and it was the moment the whole country started paying attention. The 45 angels arrived on a Thursday morning, rolling into Jackson in a thunder of chrome and leather that made the ground shiver. They didn't come armed with chains and shotguns. They came with folding chairs, coolers of food, and a quiet, unshakable resolve that terrified the sheriff more than any weapon ever could. Big Mike had given one order: no violence unless they come through the door. So the angels set up a perimeter around the Dupree house, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in shifts of 15. They played cards on the new porch. They taught Jerome how to check a bike's oil. They took Miss Celia to her doctor's appointments in a sidecar. Sheriff Baines drove past every morning slow, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He wanted to break it up, to arrest every last one of them for vagrancy or loitering or breathing while unshaven. But he couldn't. The Angels weren't breaking any laws, and more importantly, the press had arrived. After the Jackson Daily News ran its smear piece, a young reporter from a national magazine, a man with glasses thick as Coke bottles and a name nobody could pronounce, showed up with a notebook and a camera. He expected a race riot. He found a giant white biker teaching a skinny black kid how to fix a carburetor. That photograph, published a week later on the cover of Life magazine under the headline, "The Unlikeliest Friendship in Mississippi," broke something open in the American consciousness. Clayton Hargrove saw that magazine cover and knew his time was running out. The FBI had caught wind of Crow's little black book. Agents from New Orleans arrived quietly, interviewing the Dupree family's neighbors, pulling old records on Eustace Pritchard's barber shop. The night before the raid, Hargrove tried one last play. He and 6 Reapers drove to the Dupree house at 2 in the morning. They didn't even make it past the lawn. 4 Angels stood up from the porch, and behind them, lights flicked on in every house on the block. The neighbors, black families who had been too afraid to speak up for years, stepped onto their porches with baseball bats, cast-iron skillets, and a quiet fury that said no more. Hargrove turned his bike around without a word. The raid on Pritchard's shop happened 3 days later. Investigators found ledgers stretching back 15 years, detailing loan sharking, gambling debts, and a pattern of disappearances that matched the timeline of James Dupree's murder. Pritchard was arrested on the shop floor, a straight razor still in his hand. Hargrove fled the state and was picked up in Texas a month later. The Dixie Reapers dissolved within the year, and for the first time in living memory, the black residents of the West Side walked the streets without fear. But the story doesn't end there. That's just the justice part. The deeper payoff happened quieter. As autumn turned the air crisp, Miss Celia's cough finally healed thanks to regular medical care funded by an anonymous donation from a motorcycle club in Oakland. Jerome started school in September, the first time he'd ever owned new shoes and a full belly of breakfast. Big Mike drove him on the back of his Harley every single morning, right up to the schoolhouse door, past the stares and the whispers and the hatred that still simmered beneath the surface. He never said much on those rides. Just a pat on the helmet and "learn something good today." It was enough. One afternoon, Jerome asked the question he'd been holding inside for months. "Big Mike, are you gonna leave now?" They were sitting on the porch, the same porch that had been rebuilt twice, once with lumber, once with love. Big Mike stared at the road for a long time. He'd been president of the Mississippi chapter, a feared enforcer, a man who'd never stayed in one place longer than a week. He wasn't built for roots. But something had shifted in him the day he'd said those 4 words in the diner. He wasn't the same man anymore. "I ain't going nowhere, boy," he said finally. "Your daddy got cheated out of watching you grow up. I figure somebody ought to fill in." He kept that promise. Big Mike stayed in Jackson. He stepped down from the National Angels to focus on the local chapter, turning it into a community fixture that ran food drives and repaired neighbors' homes. He never married, never had children of his own, but he walked Jerome to his first day of high school, then to his college dormitory, then to his first job interview at an engineering firm. He was there when Jerome got married. He was there when Miss Celia passed peacefully in her sleep at 92, her hand in his. And when Jerome named his first son Michael, Big Mike held that baby in his arms and wept. The surprising detail that almost nobody knows is this. 40 years later, a young black attorney named Michael Dupree Jr. stood before a judge in Jackson, Mississippi, to argue one of the first major civil rights cases of the new century. On the wall of his law office next to his diploma hangs a single photograph in a tarnished frame. It's the Life magazine cover from 1963. The giant white biker and the skinny black kid bent over a carburetor. Underneath it, in his father's handwriting, 4 words: "The boy's with me." 4 words spoken in a diner on a sweltering afternoon in 1963. 4 words that cracked a system of hatred wide enough for a lifetime of love to pour through. We like to imagine that change requires legislation, marches, Supreme Court rulings, and it does. But sometimes it also requires a single person in a single moment to look past every rule they've been taught and simply say, Not on my watch. The question I keep coming back to, the one that haunts me about this whole story, is what would have happened if Big Mike had stayed in that booth? If he'd finished his coffee and walked out clean? Jerome would have walked home hungry that day, and the day after that his grandmother might not have survived the winter, and the house would have fallen down, and Pritchard would still be running his empire, and no one would have stopped it. A whole future, a lawyer, a family, a century of ripple effects was hanging by the thread of one man's refusal to look away. We all have that diner counter. We all see someone waiting too long while the world turns its back. The $5 in their hand. The hope that's almost gone. And the only real question is whether we'll be the sixth door that stays closed or the seventh door that opens. If this story moved you, do more than just feel it. Leave a comment and tell me about a time someone stood up for you or a time you wish they had. Drop a heart so the next person scrolling can find this. And share it with someone who needs to remember that quiet courage can rewrite a whole family's future. Because somewhere, right now, on a dusty road or a crowded lunch counter, someone is still waiting for 4 words that change everything. Be the one who says them.